Hi, welcome to class. We're the only two right now, but the other ones will show up eventually, right? I hate my life. I hate my life.
And Professor Sunreis Productions!
Hello class, Professor Sunreis here. In today's class, we're gonna take a look at branded Despia, what its overall deck archetype is, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and how to capitalize on them. And especially for virtual players out there, I got you covered. All you Mami Shanshan enjoyers out there, I'm gonna give you the best tips you can have to beat that matchup. Spoiler alert, it's actually pretty bad. We're struggling against that, but I'm gonna give you everything you need to beat that deck as consistently as possible. So without further ado, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave some feedback down in the comment section below. And I'm also gonna link you the giveaway video. This is the second to last video I did, I think, on this channel. This is still going on until Friday, so I'm gonna leave you the link in the description down below so you can take part in that. It's gonna be a Dimension Force display and an ultimate rare out of OTS 18. I'm not gonna say which one. It's not Fusion Destiny though, so don't be scared. So let's get right into the video. So guys, before we get into the actual information, I want to ask you guys quickly if you prefer me to do videos like this, like in this format, where I'm actually having a deck list of the deck I'm talking about and me going over everything I want to talk about, or if you want, like in the last video of Eldritch, if you want replays. In the background, I'm just talking about everything. I think both have their benefits, both have their problems. Replay can be really good, of course, to get the theory into action, so you can see the actual thoughts put into action. But it can also be really distracting, and I think also having like just a neutral background and maybe just having the cards I'm talking about in the forefront and nothing else distracting you from that can be really crucial, because overall it's just about the information and you guys have to put that information into gameplay on your own way, and maybe it doesn't help. So definitely leave some feedback down for that, and let's get right into the information. So let's start out. Despia is an actual control deck to its core. I would put it even to the slower side. I mean, decks like Orchis and Salad were also really good control decks, but they were more into the mid-range route. It doesn't really try to kill you at all. It does have big beat sticks, so it can really kill you in the crackback, but it's very hard at OTKing on its own. Doesn't have a lot of tempo. It just tries to put out enough disruption to clear the opponent's board, or if it's going first, to disrupt the opponent's plays strong enough that they don't have a way to get on the crackback. And with their strong resource loop, mostly over Branded and Red, they then try to kill the opponent on the following turn with like huge beat sticks like Mirror Jade, Guiding Chimera, Masquerade burning a lot. So that's the main game plan. What are the deck's biggest strengths? So guys, before we get into the actual information, I want to ask you guys quickly if you prefer me to do videos like this, like in this format, where I'm actually having a deck list of the deck I'm talking about and me going over everything I want to talk about, or if you want, like in the last video of Eldritch, if you want replays. In the background, I'm just talking about everything. I think both have their benefits, both have their problems. Replay can be really good, of course, to get the theory into action, so you can see the actual thoughts put into action. But it can also be really distracting, and I think also having like just a neutral background and maybe just having the cards I'm talking about in the forefront and nothing else distracting you from that can be really crucial, because overall it's just about the information and you guys have to put that information into gameplay on your own way, and maybe it doesn't help. So definitely leave some feedback down for that, and let's get right into the information. So let's start out. Despia is an actual control deck to its core. I would put it even to the slower side. I mean, decks like Orchis and Salad were also really good control decks, but they were more into the mid-range route. It doesn't really try to kill you at all. It does have big beat sticks, so it can really kill you in the crackback, but it's very hard at OTKing on its own. Doesn't have a lot of tempo. It just tries to put out enough disruption to clear the opponent's board, or if it's going first, to disrupt the opponent's plays strong enough that they don't have a way to get on the crackback. And with their strong resource loop, mostly over Branded and Red, they then try to kill the opponent on the following turn with like huge beat sticks like Mirror Jade, Guiding Chimera, Masquerade burning a lot. So that's the main game plan. What are the deck's biggest strengths? In my opinion, the deck's biggest strength is definitely super polymerization. This is the most unfair thing the deck does, basically just because it gets rid of opponent resources, and most importantly, cannot be chained to. So there's basically nothing you can do around that if the opponent has it, unless you can somehow play around that. So definitely take a look at your own engine in your own deck and see how you can best play around super polymerization. The usual super polymerization targets are if the opponent has Fallen of Albas, you basically can do nothing because they go into everything, and as long as you have something from the extra deck, a light or a dark, you are basically screwed. Other than that, the super poly targets are Dracopstelia if you have a fusion, a dark monster, and Despia and Quertus if they normal summon an Aluba, and even a Masquerade Dragon. So if the opponent is opening an Aluba, you definitely have to fear those two. So if you have a light or a dark, that's like the usual thing you can play around. So if you have a light or a dark on the end board, for example, Ultimate Sulkin, try to get rid of that as best as possible, or just be prepared for that. And talking about Super Poly, it's also a really good tool to get rid of Alubas or Fallen of Albases and dodge targeting negates. For Fallen of Albas, it doesn't really come up that much, but if you have an Imperm, for example, and the opponent is normal summoning Aluba, just think about twice if you really want to Imperm that, because if the opponent has a Super Poly, they can both get rid of your resources and even dodge the Impermanence. And an Impermanence is also really good on the fusion target of the Aluba. It basically gets the same job, and if you get rid of that, it's just a little higher value. So definitely try to keep that in mind. If the opponent has a Super Poly, they can definitely dodge your targeting gates. So now that we know that super polymerization is broken, let's talk about the actual Despia engine and what it actually does. So probably all of you know that, but we just really want to get over that quickly because it's really important to know what the actual engine does. So Despia itself tries to set up a Mirror Jade with them branded in red. And that usually leads to having another Mirror Jade because they have access to Ad Libitum, which summons the Mirror Jade back, and a Guardian Chimera. So the bare minimum that the engine is probably is a non-targeting Banish and Pop and a Draw 2. The Pop is, I think it's also non-targeting. Yes, it's also a non-targeting Pop. So non-targeting Pop and non-targeting Banish is the bare minimum it tries to resolve. And having to that a Draw 2. That's not too much, but you gotta remember that's what they're trying to do. They don't even want you to be unplayable. They have no problem of you just committing a little more to the board, because it's really hard to commit to a board which gets disrupted and having to deal with the Mirror Jade effect if it leaves the field. So it either gets banished or it goes to the graveyard. It pops everything in the back, the end phase. It's very hard to deal with for lots of decks and can be really stressful. So that's like the bare minimum, and usually it has something differently with that. If they have like access to the Edge Imp engine, they can usually get into Dracopstelia or Masquerade, so it becomes even harder to navigate the board because they have that one targeting negate, or they have that Masquerade Burn always looming in the back and you putting you basically on the clock and making it even harder to survive the next turn, as you have to play through a Mirror Jade Pop in the end phase lots of times, and then you have to play through Masquerade, so you're basically at like 2,000 life points and the opponent is like playing so many big speed sticks. It can be quite hard to out all of them, put disruption on you up on your own, having actual meaningful disruption against a deck like that. It can be very hard, and add to that if they have like a shit ton of Despia cards in their hand. So if they have like Ad Libitum or Tragedy resolved, especially Ad Libitum because it's like the most important thing. With Branded Fusion, they can also set up a snow, so you could even have to deal with a snow. Adding to all that, so it can become really hard to actually play through all of that. So that's like the most basic game plan the deck is trying to accomplish, and you should always have in mind. Well, this current deck list I'm currently having here is the list of Thunder Theory, who got, I think, 3rd place at the Austrian Nationals, and this list basically also got 1st place. A few people are not on the crossouts and are actually on Mercurio, I think it's called, so the engine can actually have a monster negate. Adding to that, it also gives you like a few resources back if you banish it. It's really good with a lure because you can get an Albion with it. So this is by no means a definitive list, and not a lot of people are on Crossroads, though Crossroads really covers one of the deck's biggest weaknesses, and maybe some people will get into that more depending on how the format of course shifts, because we are leaning definitely into a more hand trap heavy format again, and the deck does have its struggles against that, but we'll get to that once we talk about the weaknesses. The last strength of the deck is definitely the amount of draw power you have in it. To some extent, this will give you access to a shit ton of side deck cards, though this gets offset by the weakness that the deck actually doesn't really have a lot of space for side decks card, but we'll get to that. So you have 3 allures, you have an Edge engine which gives you a shit ton of resources and thins out the deck, so the deck is actually super consistent, and it basically feels like every hand they have access to Branded Fusion. They only have 10 copies realistically, maybe 11 if they play foolish, but they definitely always have that just because they have so much draw power and so much deck thinning going on. If I had as many branded fusion access as I had virtual world names. I would have never had a breaking problem with virtual world, but it is what it is. So definitely keep that in mind if you're trying to evaluate what you want to do, and you think, they probably don't have that. They will always have that just because they have so much draw going on in the deck, which is definitely a really good thing for them. And then even adding to that, they still have the Guardian Chimera draw too, so they basically have everything all the time that they want. And last but not least, Branded and Lost is a very disgusting card, as it covers one of the deck's biggest weaknesses, being spell trap negates, which are most easily accessible by negating activations, which Branded and Lost prevents because it's basically a meltdown for fusion spells. Well, meltdown is for fusion spells, but it's basically a permanent spell trap or a spell having the same effect as meltdown, so it becomes really hard to play through that, and it basically forces out the negate. Luckily, Branded and Lost gets hit by disruption, which is usually quite bad against Branded Despia, mostly targeting pops like a Chucha, for example. If you're playing Virtual World, this can be very good to hit. So it's not the end of the world, but it's definitely something you have to keep in mind and have to play accordingly, and maybe save those disruptions for that card, because it's definitely one of the deck's biggest strength going into its biggest weakness. So to conclude here real quick, the deck's biggest strength is, in my opinion, definitely the super polymerization access, giving you a shit ton of unfair possibilities into the opponent's board. Not only dodging target negation on your normal summons, but overall just getting rid of negates quite easily and having no chance to deal with that. And then add to that a very strong and not really robust engine, but a very consistent engine, which gives a lot of pops to the opponent. So if you're struggling against that, you will have a really hard time against that if you can't really deal with 2 or 3 of your bodies getting removed. It can be quite hard to beat the deck, and having a shit ton of draw power with that, so it's pretty consistent. And most importantly, it's very hard to deal with everything, as everything floats basically, everything gets rid of stuff. This is definitely the biggest strength of the deck, and add to that extra unfairness and extra like choke points where you have to do something in cards like Branded Lost. It just overall becomes really hard to deal with the deck like that, but it definitely still has some weaknesses, and we will get into this now. So now we're talking about the strength weakness, and there are still plenty of them, so don't get discouraged too much. Hope is still there. So most importantly, as you can probably already tell from the cross-outs and only 2 hand traps with that, the deck really struggles against Ash, because it only has really one really big play, and everything else is like 2 to 3 card combo and basically requires your whole hand, so it's not really that consistent. And DD Crow, because Branded and Red, has to actually get the target back into hand to resolve its fusion effect. So if you get rid of the target they try to get back, oftentimes it's an ad libitum. They don't actually get to a fusion summon, and because the way the combo actually works, a lot of times the first Mirror Jade, which is on the board, can't actually use its effect, because it's only once per copy on that basically. It's only every 2 turns, so if they use it in their own turn to send the Albion to get the Branded and Red, and then they try to use Branded and Red to get ad libitum, which would summon back the Mirror Jade, and would you summon a Guardian Chimera, and by disrupting that Branded and Red with the DD Crow, to some extent a Ghost Spell if Branded and Lost is not on the field, or a Cult by the Grave to just get rid of the target they're trying to add back, you get rid of so many of the resources. It actually feels quite unfair for the Despia player, not gonna lie. This doesn't happen all the time. A lot of times they will definitely still have some form of disruption, so don't get too encouraged by that. They also have cards like Mercuria, which can stop that, so they still have some in-engine ways to deal with that, but those hand traps are definitely really strong, and you really want to have an Ash into everything right now because it's so good, and definitely want to have a DD Crow in the side or main deck, as it's just so strong against Despia Branded. Adding to that, I definitely can only recommend an evenly matched. The deck does lack hard negates if they have no way to get them into the engine. They have no way to actually have an Omni negate, so evenly matched can be really good. Remember, this is in control deck, so evenly matched, getting rid of a lot of disruption, a lot of resources, can be really beneficial. They basically have to use their Branded and Red, and they will get no value of the Guardian Chimera, and they basically will only have a Mirror Jade negate after that. So if you can play through that, it's going to be really good. And most importantly, it deals with pesky extra back row. So if they have, for example, the new Branded Trap, which can also be like basically a extra copy of Branded and Red, or they have some side deck cards, for example, an anti-spell or something like that, which they don't have to play because that can hurt them as well. But a lot of people still side those cards in. Evenly Matched can even have extra value against that. And most importantly, it also hits a Masquerade Dragon, so you can actually play it through a double Masquerade board quite effectively with that. And most importantly, they don't even go into the graveyard, because this is where a lot of the cards of them actually float. So you not only get rid of a lot of their resources, you get rid of a lot of their disruption, and you get rid of a lot of their follow-up for that. So which is basically also resources, but it's something else. And it's only really that strong because they like hard negates. So keep that in mind. They are very fragile to blowout cards, like Evenly Matched. So you should always play them, as they are also really good against branded Eldritch variants, or all of the stun decks which are currently maybe running around. They can also be really good against professorsunreis, but this is not part of the video, so I'm gonna stop talking about that now. But definitely keep Evenly Matched in mind. I've put it in my side deck, and I'm playing a deck which actually wants Zeus access, and I'm still feeling quite good with that in this matchup. I'm always starting an Evenly Matched in DD Crow, and I'm doing okay against Despia, I would say. So while Ash is of course probably the best and most consistent tool against branded, it's very hard and very important to evaluate when to throw it in. Like you always probably do. You really want to hit the branded fusion with that, as it hits the most tempo. If, for example, if you Ash and Aluba, they can have a hard for branded fusion, and that would just suck. But they also have a card like Branded Opening, which can pitch an HM Chain, and which can give you a lot of resources. And even if you then hit the branded fusion, the opponent theoretically can still extend quite well. If they, for example, have a hard drawn Fallen of Albas or anything else, they can still get into quite a few disruptions into you. So how do I evaluate that? Well, a lot of times I will only Ash the branded opening if I have a very good hand. I can definitely play through a branded fusion still hard in the hand. For example, if I have extra disruption in the form of DD Crow, of an Evenly, for example, I would definitely just let them commit and just hit the branded fusion, as I kind of want them to commit into that. So it's all really hand dependent, but overall, if you have a very good hand, I can recommend just hitting the branded opening. And if you have a really bad hand, you kind of want to hit the branded fusion, just so that you get most value out of the hand, out of the Ash, and you can at best hope that they have nothing else and they don't really have a play after that. So that's always how I evaluate the usage of Ash against that deck, and you can really take this concept into everything else, into every matchup, into every decision you want to have. You always want to evaluate how much does my hand do, how much can I play around and hand trap and use the disruption accordingly to that. So definitely keep this in mind. This is not something which is only according to branded Despia, but you can put it on every aspect of this game, basically. And lastly, the deck's biggest weakness definitely has to be the lack of disruption it actually puts up. Me, a virtual player, can't really capitalize on that, because the disruption is like the best and most important disruption to have on a virtual player. Just getting rid of the bodies is just so hard for me to recover, because a lot of times I realistically only have two ways to get a body on the board: the one normal summon and then the one E-Teller or the one Kowloon. If they can get rid of both of those, it can be quite hard to actually play into the board. But a deck like Sword Soul, a high tempo, high aggro, very fast deck like Sword Soul or Dinosaur can just completely crush the branded Despia player. And this is also the main reason why Sword Soul is just so popular right now, just because it shits on branded Despia so hard. They don't really care about pops too much. They have very easy accessible bounces, which are very important, basically mandatory to play into every deck right now, just because Mirror Jade is just a pain in the ass to deal with, and it's just so easy to bounce it into the extra deck where the effect can't trigger, and then you don't have to deal with the end phase black dark hole, basically. So definitely this is the biggest weakness. Play a high tempo deck which doesn't care too much about pops, and at best has a very consistent way into a bounce, and then you will have basically very little problems against branded Despia. But if you really want to have problems against the deck, I can highly recommend Virtual World. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how you can minimize those problems just slightly, so you can get into like a 50-50, 60-40 percent matchup against that. 60-40 sadly being probably into the Despia's person's favor. But anyways, let's get into some Virtual World tricks. So, like I said, Virtual World does have a hard time against Despia, but it's not unwinnable. I'm going to give you everything I learned about that matchup right now. So, most importantly, I am actually on Brave Virtual World right now, not because it's the best against Despia. I still think Sword Soul is better against the Despia matchup overall, but the meta is actually going away from Despia quite a little bit, mostly because people are trying to test out Punk Therians and everything with Therians for now, so they are fewer on Despia. I can definitely see a lot of people switching from that deck. And Virtual is actually quite good against those decks again, so they don't need to have the Sword Soul engine to even be playable against Despia. And can always go for the Brave route, which has the same strength of the Sword Soul engine, giving you the double Synchro 10 setup, which is, in my opinion, mandatory right now to play in Virtual World. But most importantly, it's just slightly more consistent because I can reliably go into virtual plays with them, and virtual red plays are just slightly stronger again because the Ascension actually does something against Punk, and Sword Soul is everywhere right now, and having a tutorable token collector is just really good, and I have quite had some success with that. But once people are more in Despia again, I'm definitely going to play Sword Soul Virtual World again, just because the sheer amount of power is so good against that matchup. But let's talk about Brave Virtual again, and most importantly, double Synchro 10 setups, which this deck does quite easily and arguably a little more consistent, just because Enchantress is accessible by Beatrice. So why are these so important? Most importantly, you definitely need one Omni Negate to not get completely run over, because you always want to negate at least one of their fusions. We can always do that because we have Tutor, which basically does nothing against the matchup, apart from hitting Branded and Lost and hitting 4 of Albert's normal summons, which a lot of times they only really commit to if they have a super polymerization anyways, where the Tutor doesn't even do that much anyways. But overall, we have a very consistent Omni Negate against that one Branded Fusion, so they basically have to have Edge Engine or another Branded Fusion hard drawn to even have a playable hand against us a lot of times. And adding to that, the Cheng Ying, which disruption-wise doesn't really do a lot, but most importantly, it's so hard for them to out, as they basically have to out this plus a Crystal Wing, because Crystal Wing would deal with their board way too well next turn. So they have two very hard to out boss monsters against them, which is like really good, as the deck, like we said already, is a control deck. So it doesn't really have that high of a tempo. And actually just having a Cheng Ying laying there on the board is so strong. And gave me huge success, and even in Sword Soul Virtual, I can definitely recommend you guys play this guy. You can always force its pop out with your own Tutor, so you can convert your Tutor into a banish, a non-targeting banish from field and grave. It's not that much added benefit, and the other Sword Soul Synchro 10 guy is definitely stronger in a vacuum, but people are not really on too much Brave Engine right now. Where the other Synchro 10 of course shines, so I can definitely just recommend this to you guys. Virtual also is not a control deck at heart, but it does have a lot of resources. Just having that really hard to out body on the field is actually so good. It feels kind of weird because it doesn't really do too much for the deck, but just him laying there on the field is just so much pressure he puts on, because the opponent needs to out it, because if he doesn't out it, this plus the Virtual World follow-up is just way too strong for any deck basically to deal with. So definitely check out the good Synchro 10 guy, Cheng Ying, not the bad one. We are good people here, we are Mommy Shanshan enjoyers after all, so definitely test this out. Double Synchro 10 is mandatory in my opinion. The Brave Engine is also really cool, just because it has a very accessible bounce for the Mirror Jade, so definitely keep that in mind. This is really helpful against the matchup, though it's a lot of times hard to get that off, because a lot of times they will just banish the Brave token just because of the bounce. But then again, it's a very nice way to force out the first disruption they have, and if they don't have everything else, because you maybe even lead them, for example, you can get into quite an easy Virtual World line if they have to use their first banish on the token basically, otherwise they lose their Mirror Jade. So then let's talk about the Virtual Engine, how to capitalize most effectively on that. So we have a Shenshen, we can basically cut that out. Of course it's nice for a grind game, but against Despia I put very little value on the Shenshen anyways, just because it does basically nothing. The only thing which you reliably hit is a branded opening, which you then, you don't hit it, it just goes into the banish pile, so you can actually use the Choo-Choo to pop something. You have a Crystal Wing, which can be really good against an Aluba, can be really good against an Fawn of Albaz, it can be really good against a Fusion if they don't chain block it, so this is definitely a very good disruption against them. Sadly it's just not enough. And then you have a Choo-Choo, which has okay accessibility into the matchup. It can hit the field spell, which some people are playing, so that basically can hit a Fusion. It can hit the Branded and Lost, which is basically the most important card it can hit, just so that they don't have that extra card they can add. They can actually use your Omni Negate with Baron de Fleur on their fusions. And lastly, you can hit the Fallen of Albas, which is of course a really good hit, but a lot of times I feel like they only normal summon it if they have basically nothing, in which case you almost always win with your engine, or they have a super polymerization where it then doesn't really do a lot anyways. But Chucha is definitely putting in work against that matchup. It's good enough. Talking about super polymerization, basically the biggest strength Virtual World has over the over Branded Despia on the endboard is it's super hard to super polymerization us. The super polymerization is basically dead unless they have a Fallen of Albas, in which case it's quite okay. It gives them into the engine, but it also really needs quite a few cards in hands. So if they have Fallen of Albas, pitch something, we try to pop, chain super polymerization, pitch something. They did start to crack our board, but most importantly, we already got rid of 4 of their cards. So even in a grind game, we can still basically get into the game quite okay-ish, I would say. But the only real super poly target there is in this deck is Ultimate Sulkin, and we can always get rid of that because I'm always basically trying to go for a Baron, so we can definitely always pop that Sulkin. So now we have no light or darks in our field, and everything Despia has basically no application against with super poly against us, because everything is basically wind on our end board or water, and they have no way to reliably hit those things with super poly unless they of course have the Fallen of Albas. So this is definitely a huge plus for Virtual World and has been coming up quite a lot with super poly. It's just not that good against us. And lastly, like I said guys, this matchup is quite bad. The last tip I can have for you guys at M7 at back Ash is really crucial in the grind game. Like I said, the engine, Despia engine I'm talking about, is quite susceptible to Ash, and most importantly is quite predictable. A lot of times you definitely always know what the opponent's plays will be, just because in a grind game it's most of the time just get Branded Fusion and then activate it and control the game with Mirror Jade. So if you have the accessibility with an M7, you should always go for that, especially if you have the have to decide, okay, can I go for Crystal Wing or should I go for an M7? M7 at back Ash is, in my opinion, 99% of the time the better play, just because the engine, especially in a grind game, dies to 1 Ash. So keep that in mind. And when I'm talking about it, I did try to test it, but I had no success with it. But Dawn Dragster is a very good card to maybe put in. It is a Synchro 7 with a Spell Trap Negate, though I'm testing, I decided that the double Synchro 10 route is just a little stronger for me, because a lot of times they still will have some form to deal with that, and if they have Branded and Lost and they got rid of the Chucha, the Dawn Dragster doesn't really do anything, and just having that one Changing there, laying on the field, looming its presence, just being very hard for them to deal with, is in my opinion more important. While a Dawn Dragster of course would be a very good addition to that, everything else in the extra deck in my opinion is just so much better. Of course you could cut a Yazi, but Yazi against basically every other matchup is just so strong going second, and Dawn Dragster would really only be there, and in my opinion the Changing is just better. Maybe it's not really better in the Despia matchup, but it's better against everything else. But if you really don't want to care about the Despia matchup and you just want it to be as easy as possible, you can definitely put in a Dawn Dragster into your extra deck, guys. So that's been it for today's class. I hope you could learn something from the Despia matchup, and for all of you virtual players out there, I'm with you. I hate this deck so much. I can't wait for Punk Theory to make a splash into the meta, so that Despia players maybe get punished by not playing any hand traps at all and just getting looped out of the game by the Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Calamity thing, Synchro 12, Kali Yuga on the opponent's turn basically. So hope you guys enjoyed today's class. Professor Sunreis out. Peace.